Hey there everyone, this is the Vintage Sewing Machine Garage, and as promised I am adding to the video series that I'm making, and this one is essentially going to cover some of the accessories that you might come across in your search for a vintage sewing machine. Some of you may have any number of accessories, and keep in mind this is not an exhaustive overview. There were a ton of different accessories made over the years for sewing machines. Some of you, when you get a vintage sewing machine, you may get a bunch of this stuff or none of it. Sometimes you'll get the machine and you'll either get a bag or a box of things, or if you get a table especially, sometimes those sewing tables, you should always check them. Even if you don't keep the table for some reason, which hopefully you will, but look through the drawers of those sewing tables, guys, because sometimes there are an unbelievable number of sewing attachments and accessories that the original owner may have gotten when they bought the machine, or chances are they collected them over time, over the years. What's interesting about these accessories is that today, many people, and those of you who have new machines or people who use new current sewing machines, you can still get lots of attachments for those as well, but you don't typically see as many of them because modern machines have a lot of things built in. And you will notice that as you go into, even in the vintage era, you go into the 50s and the 60s, a lot of machines would advertise that they could do things automatically. And part of that attraction to try to get people to buy sewing machines, the new models, was to say, hey, you don't have to do this particular function manually anymore. Now, as I've mentioned to you guys, most of the accessories from the vintage days are made incredibly well. They're made to the same quality level as the machines are. And so you might get some of these things and have absolutely no idea what they are. And again, there are many of these. I'm basically just, barely scratching the surface. But I wanted to show some of these to you guys so you'd have an idea of what they are and, why they were important to people in the time and why you might want to have some of them. You might sell some of them. You might keep some of them. And that's really important. And the main goal here, folks, is I want to talk to you about the devices themselves, just in the same way I talk to you about all the vintage machines that we love and are interested in, because my primary skill background is in the mechanics of vintage sewing machines, and less so in terms of sewing techniques. The great thing is you can go online, you can go to lots of wonderful blogs and video channels, YouTube channels, and you can type in a specific accessory, and there are people who can demonstrate to you beautifully how these accessories were used. And I personally wanted to learn how to use a Singer Buttonholer once, and so I went onto YouTube just like you guys do, and I went looking to see how to use one. And there are great videos online already for that. So I wanted to talk to you about the devices themselves a little bit, mostly just to help identify them. Sometimes it's kind of obvious what they're for, and sometimes not so much. Let's see. Here is one I think I referenced the other day in a video, and I was talking to you guys about blind stitch attachments, right? But I don't think I actually talked about it. So if you went into a Singer dealer and you bought a machine, this came with, you may notice in the background, there's a black Singer 301 that I just picked up and rescued, and I'm going to be doing a full restoration of this machine. Anyway, it came with a series of attachments. Now, I'm going to do a separate video on sewing feet. I'm not going to try to squeeze that into this video because it can go a little long because there are lots of sewing feet. So I'll do a separate video there. But this is something that chances are the sewer probably would have paid extra for in 1951 when they purchased this beautiful Singer 301. And blind stitch attachment would be very useful because remember, anytime you want to hem a garment, whether it's a new garment that was being made or altered, you needed, or you really wanted to have something like a blind stitch capability, because blind stitching, for those of you who don't know, if you want to see a demonstration of blind stitching, you can go online, and I think I've shown one in my Neki Nora video, but I was doing it with a stitch cam. But you can see what they look like. But they are designed to be able to use in hemming so that you don't have lots of stitches showing. And you also have to remember that years ago, people made most of their clothes at home. And if they had a large family, you might have someone who wore something, and maybe a sibling, as they grew out of that garment, it might need to be altered or rehemmed in some way so that a younger sibling, it was the classic hand-me-down, right? So having blind stitch would have been very useful. Now, just like buttonholers, these came with a separate little manual, so it would tell you how to use your blind stitch attachment. And I'm not going to set this up today because, again, there are great videos online already demonstrating this. But of course, the blind stitch attachment had, and you saw it rolling out of the box here when I opened it, it had its own set screw, a nice, big, heavy, high quality set screw. And of course, you would attach it here to the presser foot. And then it was designed to work with the machine. And because this was a slant shank machine, this would have been specific to slant shanks. And when I talk about feet, I'm going to talk to you guys about shank. You heard the term shank all the time, and a lot of people still don't know what that means. But in any case, this device was used, and it would allow the machine to sew a blind stitch. And just like the machines, I've talked to you guys about quality. Look at this, it's all steel, right? And I know this one was actually used a bit because you can see there's a little bit of paint chipping here where they would have chipped the paint when they were trying to install it. Let's turn it around so the Singer name's not upside down. And just like vintage machines, notice it has a little screw here, right? Anytime you see something like that, that's a clear indication that this was designed to be taken apart and serviced. Servicing, in this case, usually meant maybe cleaning and oiling once a year, because some of these devices were used more often than you might think. But again, this is an example of one of the attachments, and I suspect this would have been a little more popular than some of them. Some of these attachments can seem awfully obscure, but I typically see this attachment, and I also see zigzagger attachments. I don't have one here today, I don't believe, but the zigzagger would attach to the machine in a similar fashion, and of course it would move the fabric from side to side because a straight stitch machine could not move the needle laterally, and it would make a zigzag stitch. So again, people would go to great lengths. They had to pay extra for many of these items in order to get a straight stitch machine to do some of these functions. Now, this is one I kind of showed you guys the box the other day. This is a stocking darner. Now, it's hard to believe this, but once upon a time, people would take their socks and even some pieces of clothing, but this is specifically designed for a sock or stocking, hosiery, and the sock would be these little pieces come over. I don't know if you can see me moving these guys. You should be able to find there are YouTube videos of people demonstrating these. It's quite fascinating. And the little ring here would function not unlike an embroidery ring, and you would attach your sock to this and you would hold it open while you darned the sock. And of course, darning is not unlike free motion embroidery, except you're patching a hole when you darn something. And this helps explain why virtually all of your vintage sewing machines have the capacity to what is called a feed dog drop. So as you know, when you are sewing, and as the sewing machine moves, the feed dogs are feeding the fabric, and they come up, they rise like this, they sort of move in this motion, and the fabric feeds along, thus the name feed dog. But of course, you wanted to be able to stop that when you were darning or doing any kind of free motion embroidery, because you didn't want the machine feeding the fabric. You wanted to control it with your hands. Now, I mentioned the other day, I was showing you guys, I think I mentioned this in the vintage sewing parts video. This is the piece that I showed. A few of the machines, in fact, if you keep going back in history to some of the earliest sewing machines, they did not have the capacity to drop the feed dogs, but you could cover them. Now these, and you'll see one is chrome and one is what is called black side. A lot of the parts that you see here, I say chrome, but this was sort of nickel plated, possibly chrome plated steel. And sometimes you'll see these little dark black versions. A lot of these were manufactured during the Second World War. We had a lot of material shortages, and nickel, being an important metal, was in short supply. And so Singer had to come up with, they had a special process. I'm not sure if it was the same as anodizing, but it was a way of putting a coating on the steel which would protect it from rusting. But anyway, the main point here is that for certain machines, I believe these were for the Singer 66 and 99 models, you would attach this cover. That was not needed on the 301, by the way. I'm just using this as an example. So you would attach this cover over the needle plate so that the feed dogs could come up and down, and they would be able to keep moving in this little recessed area underneath, and above you would have control of the fabric and be able to do the darning or whatever you needed to do. Now, some of you will have seen this. This is more common. This would have been, again, a feed dog cover, and if this was a Singer 66 model, you would have it here, and you would attach it with a set screw. Many of you will see holes in the beds of your vintage sewing machines that are sometimes to the right of the needle plate. And that's in part what many of these holes are for. It's for you to be able to attach covers when you need to. And then this one is a little shorter. It probably was for the 99, and the other would have been, say, for the Singer 66. Let me bring these up here. You can see. So sometimes you'll see them in different sizes, right? So I don't know if this is showing up, but one of these is longer than the other, and I think the shorter one is for the 99. So along those lines, while I'm talking about that, I should mention that there were other little useful things. Let's suppose that you are looking at a bunch of attachments and you see one of these little things. You think, what is that? Not everyone knows what this is. Now, the Singer 301, thankfully, was made with seam guide measurements embossed into the needle plate. But many machines before then did not have that. And I've shown you guys in the new parts video, you can get little decals for those machines if you want to. But this folks, is a seam guide. So the seam guide would be placed on the bed of the machine. It came with its own set screw. And of course, you would screw the set screw into the machine. And of course, you could slide the seam guide to suit your taste, but it was to help you when you were sewing items and you were trying, the feed dogs are moving the fabric, but you're trying to control the straightness, the straight line that you're trying to sew. Let's see, what else can we speak of? Now, the three boxes you see here, there's a burgundy box, a green, and a black box. All of these boxes hold the same device. It is one of my favorite of all the accessories. It is the Singer Buttonholer. Now, they made a number of buttonholer styles over the years. Here it is. I think I showed you guys the other day. It's got its own manual. And I've talked a lot about buttonholers, and the quality of the buttonholes that these devices make is just extraordinary, because you have a separate device that is helping move the fabric in such a way that the machine can make buttonholes. And of course, it's adjustable. And it is also, there's a screw right next to this little knob that allows me, whenever I have accessories with the machine, If I restore the machine, I restore the accessories. Usually accessories are not as time consuming. I basically open them up, clean out any dust that might be in them. Usually they just need some fresh oil and they're fine. But they are built like little tanks. And they would eventually be replaced by built-in buttonholers, although you will find that in vintage machines in the late 60s and early 70s, if your machine has a built-in buttonholer, be mindful, because those built-in buttonholers, they don't make particularly lovely buttonholes, and they can be mechanically very problematic. Now, the colors matter. The burgundy boxes are for slant shank buttonholers. The green box is the other one, and even more common, and it was for the low shank. Low shank and slant shank were the two primary shank styles that Singer had in the vintage era. Not counting the industrial machines, those are different. The older low shank Singer buttonholers were in black boxes, and for whatever reason they switched to green, and you had to have the color to tell you. Now, as a backup, if you ever get one of these and it doesn't work, it could have been swapped because they look visually the same. If you look at the low shank buttonholer, it looks just like the slant shank. But they do have codes on the back, and they have little serial numbers. You can go online and check the serial number, and it'll tell you which one you have. So again, these are, they made many of these over the years, but this is considered one of the best designs. Now, sometimes you will see buttonholers that are equal in quality and they don't say Singer. They will say greased, if I am pronouncing that word correctly. I hope I am. Greased or greased. And this Mr. Greased had an association with Singer for many years, but his company manufactured a lot of the accessories that sewing machine companies used. In fact, this greased buttonholer was designed for a high shank necky that I'm restoring. And of course, it came with its own greased instructions, right? And it says rotary buttonholer, but it's not for a rotary machine. It's actually for an oscillating necky. And then, of course, it says instructions for using your set of attachments. So again, the manufacturers would provide people with instructions on how to use these things, because if you went into a sewing dealer, and of course the salespeople knew how to use those things and they made it look simple, and then you got it home and thought, oh God, how am I going to use that? So those instruction manuals were quite useful. And I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen one of these. This is this is called a Singer Craft Guide. Now, it's a pretty long device. I think it's about 8.5 inches long. Put it down here so you can see it on the table. This was used for when you wanted to sew something and you really cared about how straight you got it. A great example of this would be fringe. Let's say you were sewing a slip cover and you wanted to sew fringe on the edge. You would attach or you probably pin the fringe to the fabric, and then you would sew along this line, and it was used to help people keep the fringe straight. That would be awful if you had gone to all this trouble to sew fringe on something and you realized it was crooked. That wouldn't really cut it. These are items you still buy. You can still see these today in sewing shops. These are clips. These were used to hold fabric together, and these are marked with measurements, and they came in different sizes. I sometimes find these in the attachment boxes that I get. And of course, some machines came with cams. You guys have heard me talk about cams before, and sewing cams were available because people eventually wanted to sew decorative stitches, all kinds of shapes. But you have to remember, when companies started to try to put decorative stitches as built-in features in machines, the machines got very complicated, such as the Singer 401, for example. And even the 401 could only sew, it only had so many built-in stitches. It still needed a few. You could buy a few decorative cams to add to your stitch inventory if you wanted. And in those days, if you could get a machine that would sew either a straight stitch or maybe straight and zigzag, and you could get cams. This is a set of Kenmore. This is the full set of the two I was showing you guys the other day. And I mean, it goes on and on. You can do all kinds of decorative stitches with these. But in order to keep the price of a machine down, if you could put these cams, by the way, you would not do this on a 301. But let's say you had a 400 series. Let me move my camera here. Very often these cams, almost always, they go in the top and there's a little door and there's a certain way they insert into the machine. And you have to change settings, but then you can do decorative stitches. In my experience, when I have gotten vintage machines before, very seldom does it look like people did a lot of these. They might have done it for children's clothes. Blind stitch and zigzag were certainly very useful if they weren't built into the machine. But these were often upsells for people, and people would have been marketed to, and they would have said, think of all the amazing things you can do with these. And you can, but practically speaking, it's not clear how many people actually used a lot of these accessories because many of these do not look particularly worn when I get them. This is a buttonholer, and this was specific to mid to late 1960s Kenmore machines. Now, unlike Singer, well, Singer did change their attachments over the years, but a lot more slowly. This is another Kenmore buttonholer, and of course, this is designed for the free arm machine that I've rescued, and I'm going to try to bring back to life. And of course, it had its own box. It had the buttonhole attachment. There's a setup here because it has a gear on it. And of course it has its own buttonhole templates, and there's an instruction manual for this too. So again, a lot of these things were upgrades for people. They could, here, this is one of the older Singer set of templates for a buttonhole attachment. I believe the one I showed you over here actually has its own set individually, and they were made of metal for a long time, and eventually they went to plastic. But like I say, guys, a lot of times when you got a Singer, for example, you would get a box of basic feet and attachments, and I'll talk about the feet in the next video. But most of these things that I've shown you, the vast majority of them, you had to pay extra for. And just like when you go to a car dealership and they ask you, do you want all-weather mats, or do you want, they always have extra stuff to sell you. Well, sewing dealers did this as well, and it was one of the ways in which they were able to generate income for their businesses outside of selling the machines, because the machines, as I have mentioned to you folks before, were very pricey. So again, if you ever come across an attachment that you're not sure what it is, it might tell you what it is, but it might, it may not be obvious to you how it was used or even why people cared about it. But the main thing to remember is a lot of these attachments that you see with vintage machines were designed to accomplish things that later machines would do automatically. Of course, there's a plus side to that. You didn't have to stop and set up the attachment. The early or the late vintage machines that had a lot of these things built in, you could move a lever and you'd have to change settings on the machine. And of course later, any of you who have a new sewing machine know that a lot of these things are computerized. But there are downsides to building in things into a sewing machine. It makes them more complex. There are more opportunities for things to have mechanical hiccups. And of course, with computerized machines, there are all sorts of issues with those that involve software. And of course, in our vintage machines, we didn't have software problems. Usually the biggest problem is getting your settings right. So anyway, I appreciate you guys watching. Again, I'm just scratching the surface here, but I wanted to show you some of the things that you would have been offered if you had gone into any sewing dealer, whether it was Singer or any of the others back in the day. And some of these attachments, they may have been things that people thought they wanted and maybe never used, but I'm willing to bet that the blind stitch attachment, the buttonholers on occasion, some of these would have gotten quite a lot of use, because it's easy for us to forget just how many of our ancestors made their own clothes. And like I said, you had to be able to hem your own things. Many people lived in places where there was no tailor. So even if you were willing to pay someone to alter a garment, you may not have had that luxury. So if you were going to alter something as a hand-me-down, or just alter it because you needed a different size, you had to do it yourself. And so all of these products were available to people. And so the term DIY is a lot older than we think. But anyway, I appreciate you guys letting me share some of this. It's always interesting to see what I find when I get a machine. Sometimes I get nothing. And with this 301, I got a number of different attachments that came with it. And anyway, feel free to comment, subscribe to the channel, guys. And if you do, let me know what you think about this, and you may have an attachment you'd like to share your experience with, or maybe you have one and you don't know what it does. But anyway, if you want, share that with us, and we'll see what we can come up with in the discussion on the video. Thank you.